Hello. Tonight, you find yourself standing at the quiet edge of a world that has not yet learned to rush, a place where nothing rises too quickly and nothing disappears too suddenly. And somewhere between two ancient rivers, something is slowly beginning to take shape. Though no one here would think to call it the beginning of civilization, you begin to notice the land stretching gently around you, a vast and open plain resting between two slow-moving rivers, the waters gliding with a calm rhythm that feels almost like a steady breath. A thin layer of morning mist drifts across the surface, softening every edge, while the first light of dawn spreads quietly across the horizon, like butter reluctantly melting on warm toast, which, if you think about it, is probably the most effort anyone should make this early in the day. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. And if you feel like it, you can leave a comment sharing where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now, because it is always strangely comforting to imagine how many different nights and quiet moments are unfolding at once across the world. Now, slowly dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room, and in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. You take a slow step forward, and the ground beneath your feet feels firm yet forgiving, shaped by countless seasons of flooding and retreat. The soil here is rich with silt carried over long distances, settling layer by layer, year after year, quietly preparing itself for life, long before anyone arrives to notice its generosity. The air carries a faint scent of damp earth, mixed with dry wind, a subtle contrast that feels balanced rather than conflicting. You breathe it in without effort, and it settles gently, as though the land itself is inviting you to slow down, which is something it seems to have mastered far better than most modern schedules. To one side, clusters of tall reeds sway softly, their slender forms bending with the breeze in a slow, repetitive motion. The sound they make is almost like a whisper shared between old friends, steady and familiar, and you find yourself listening without trying to understand, which is, admittedly, a rare and underrated skill. The rivers continue their quiet movement, never rushing, never pausing, shaping the land with a patience that feels almost intentional. You follow the curve of the water with your eyes, noticing how each bend creates small pockets of stillness, places where life seems to gather without being asked. In the distance, you begin to see small groups of dwellings, low and rounded, built from mud and straw, blending seamlessly into the earth around them. They do not stand out or demand attention. Instead, they seem to belong, as if they were always meant to be there. As you draw closer, you notice the people who live here move with a steady, unhurried rhythm. They tend to small fields of barley, guiding their hands through the soil with quiet focus, while nearby animals graze without concern, contributing to the scene with the kind of calm presence that modern office plants can only dream of achieving. There are no walls, no clear borders, and no sense of separation between one space and another. The land feels shared, understood through use, rather than defined by ownership. It is a kind of order that exists without needing to be announced, which feels surprisingly efficient, if not slightly optimistic. You notice a small channel guiding water from the river into a cultivated patch of land, a simple act that carries quiet significance. This early form of irrigation is not grand or complex, yet it reflects a subtle shift. As people begin to shape the environment, rather than simply respond to it. Historically, this moment reflects the early agricultural communities of Mesopotamia, forming between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 BCE. These are among the first settled societies, where humans begin to live in one place long enough to change it, though here, the change still feels gentle and almost unnoticed. A group of villagers gathers nearby, speaking in low, even tones. There is no urgency in their voices, no sharp gestures, just a shared understanding moving slowly between them. Leadership exists, but it feels more like guidance than control, like someone suggesting a direction rather than insisting upon it. Children move freely between the homes, their laughter light and uncontained, drifting across the open space like small ripples on water. There is no visible structure to their play, no fixed schedule, and somehow, everything still seems to unfold exactly as it should. You sit near the edge of the river, watching the surface shift with small, repeating patterns. The light reflects in soft fragments, constantly changing yet never chaotic, and you begin to feel how deeply everything here is connected to the steady passage of time. The breeze returns, carrying with it the faint hum of insects and the distant movement of water brushing against the banks. It is a sound that does not demand attention, yet once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore, like a quiet reminder that the world continues even when nothing appears to happen. As the sun rises higher, the mist slowly dissolves, revealing more of the land without ever rushing the process. Everything here unfolds gradually, as if the world itself prefers a slower pace, choosing presence over speed in a way that feels both unfamiliar and deeply reassuring. And as you sit there, listening to the river continue its endless journey, you begin to sense something subtle beneath the stillness. It is not a disruption, not even a change you can clearly name, but a quiet shift, like a current turning ever so slightly beneath the surface. The river keeps flowing, carrying with it silt, memory, and the beginnings of something that will one day grow far beyond these small settlements. It does not announce what is coming. It simply moves forward, as it always has, and somewhere within that gentle, continuous motion, something new is beginning to form. Slowly and almost invisibly, as if the land itself is preparing for a story that has not yet been told. You continue walking through the settlement, and as the morning light settles more firmly across the land, you begin to notice a gentle structure forming beneath the surface of daily life. Nothing feels imposed or rigid, yet there is a quiet order guiding how people move, work, and gather, like an invisible rhythm that everyone seems to understand without needing it explained. You observe how different individuals take on different roles, not through formal titles, but through repeated actions that slowly define their place. Some tend to fields with steady patience, while others shape clay into simple tools or vessels, and a few remain near small gathering spaces, tending to rituals that seem both ordinary and deeply meaningful, like someone carefully making tea, even when no one is watching. Near the center of the settlement, you notice a slightly larger structure, modest but intentional, where people occasionally gather in small groups. This space does not dominate the landscape, yet it holds a certain presence, suggesting that shared beliefs are beginning to take form, quietly binding individuals together in ways that go beyond simple survival. The farmers move with familiarity across the land, guiding seeds into soil that has been softened by seasonal floods. You can see how the earth responds generously, offering growth without resistance, and it becomes clear why people remain here, returning season after season, trusting the land, much like someone trusts a favorite chair to always be comfortable. The craftsmen worked nearby, shaping clay and weaving simple materials into tools that make daily life just a little easier. Their work is careful but unhurried, and while nothing appears extravagant, everything serves a purpose, which is perhaps more satisfying than owning something that looks impressive but does absolutely nothing useful. There is a quiet balance between these roles, a sense that no one part exists without the others. The farmers rely on the tools, the craftsmen rely on the harvest, and those who guide rituals help give meaning to it all, creating a soft network of interdependence that feels stable without needing to be reinforced. You begin to notice how water is guided more deliberately now, with shallow channels extending from the river into cultivated areas. These early irrigation efforts are simple, yet they represent a significant shift as people begin not only to live with nature, but to gently influence it, like adjusting a blanket rather than replacing it entirely. Historically, this moment reflects the earliest known irrigation practices in Mesopotamia, when small farming communities begin digging narrow canals to guide river water into their fields. These channels are simple and shallow, shaped by hand with basic tools, yet they represent a meaningful shift as people start to gently influence the natural flow of water rather than simply waiting for seasonal floods. This change does not feel dramatic or sudden, yet it quietly reshapes daily life in lasting ways. Crops begin to grow with greater consistency, harvests become more predictable, and uncertainty softens just a little. In learning to guide water, people gain a new sense of balance with nature. Like adjusting a dim light, instead of sitting in complete darkness, the strength of these settlements lies in their consistency. The land provides, the water returns, and the people respond with steady effort. There is little conflict, and cooperation feels natural, as if disagreement would simply require too much energy to be worth the trouble, which, to be fair, is a surprisingly effective conflict resolution strategy. You notice how people share tools, exchange goods, and assist one another without hesitation. There is no formal system enforcing this behavior, yet it persists, suggesting that community here is not a concept, but a habit, something practiced daily until it becomes almost invisible. And yet, beneath this calm stability, there are subtle limitations. The settlements depend heavily on the rivers, and while the floods bring life, they can also disrupt it. There is no way to fully predict their timing or intensity, and so a quiet uncertainty always lingers. Like checking the weather app but still bringing an umbrella, just in case. There are no large defenses, no walls or organized forces to protect against potential threats. The openness of the land invites movement, both friendly and otherwise, though for now, no significant danger seems to approach. It is a vulnerability that remains mostly theoretical, like locking your door in a neighborhood where nothing ever happens. Each settlement operates largely on its own, connected loosely through occasional contact but not bound by any larger system. This independence allows flexibility, but it also limits cooperation on a broader scale, making it difficult to respond collectively to challenges that extend beyond a single village. You begin to notice small exchanges taking place between neighboring groups. Someone arrives carrying stones not found nearby, while another offers grain or crafted goods in return. These interactions are calm and practical, forming the earliest patterns of trade, though no one here would think to call it an economy just yet. The absence of large-scale conflict feels quietly remarkable as you observe daily life unfolding. Disagreements do appear from time to time, yet they remain small, contained, and resolved without escalation. There are no signs of organized warfare or territorial ambition, only a steady coexistence that seems sustainable for now, like neighbors, sharing space without ever needing to raise their voices. As you continue watching these gentle exchanges, you begin to understand that relationships between settlements are shaped more by convenience than by competition. People meet, trade goods, and move on without tension or urgency, much like neighbors borrowing tools and returning them casually, without turning the moment into anything particularly memorable or unnecessarily complicated. The land continues to provide, the water continues to flow, and the people continue to adapt in small, meaningful ways. Every action feels incremental, building slowly upon what came before, like stacking small stones rather than constructing something all at once. And as you stand there, observing this quiet order, you begin to sense that something subtle is shifting. The more people learn to guide the water, the more they begin to shape their environment, and in doing so, they are also beginning to shape themselves in ways they do not yet fully understand. The rivers continue their steady movement, but now, for the first time, you'll notice that their paths are no longer entirely untouched. Small channels branch away, guided by human hands, and it becomes clear that when people begin to control water, even gently, they also begin to change the course of everything that follows. You begin to sense a quiet shift beyond the horizon, not in the land itself, but in the stories carried by those who occasionally pass through. Their voices remain calm and measured, yet they describe distant places where the soil resists easy growth, where the wind lingers longer than rain, and movement becomes something learned and repeated over generations. As you listen more closely, their words begin to form gentle images in your mind, places shaped by dryness, distance, and patience. They speak of journeys that stretch across open land, where staying too long in one place is rarely possible. and where each decision to move feels less like a choice and more like a quiet necessity. Far beyond the rivers you have come to know, these communities continue their steady patterns of movement. They do not wander without reason, but respond carefully to the land around them, following subtle signs of water and shelter. Their lives unfold like an ongoing conversation that never quite settles, always continuing, always adapting, without ever truly coming to rest. You imagine their days unfolding beneath a harsher sky, where shade is scarce and water must be found rather than expected. Their lives are measured not in harvests, but in journeys, and their knowledge is carried in memory rather than rooted in soil, which makes forgetting something slightly more inconvenient than misplacing your phone. These groups have learned to adapt quickly, adjusting to new conditions without resistance. Their homes are temporary, their routines flexible, and their sense of place is defined more by direction than by location. It is a way of life that values movement, not as disruption, but as continuity. Over time, their numbers grow, slowly but steadily, and the land that once sustained them begins to feel more limited. Resources that were once enough begin to stretch, thin, and the quiet balance they have maintained starts to shift. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Water becomes less predictable, and grazing lands require longer journeys to reach. Each season asks for a little more effort than the last, and while no single moment feels urgent, the accumulation of small pressures begins to guide their decisions. Much like repeatedly hitting the snooze button until waking up is no longer optional. In this gradual tightening of conditions, a new awareness begins to form. There are places, spoken of in quiet conversations, where rivers flow reliably and the ground responds generously. These places are not imagined as destinations to conquer, but as possibilities to explore. Like hearing about a cafe that actually serves good coffee and deciding it might be worth the walk. The idea of moving toward these fertile regions grows, slowly, not as a plan, but as a shared inclination. Small groups begin to travel farther than before, following routes that feel natural, guided by the land and the memory of water. Their movement is steady, unannounced, and without urgency. You begin to understand that this is not an invasion, not a force pushing forward with intent to dominate, but rather a flow of people seeking stability. They carry with them their knowledge, their habits, and their quiet resilience, arriving not as disruptors, but as participants in a landscape already in motion. Historically, this reflects the gradual migration of Semitic-speaking groups into Mesopotamia, a process unfolding slowly over many generations rather than through any single dramatic movement. These communities travel in small groups, following routes shaped by water, climate, and survival needs, allowing their presence to spread gently across the region, without creating sudden disruption or immediate transformation. These movements are shaped by environmental pressures, such as changing rainfall and limited resources, as well as the opportunity offered by fertile river valleys. As these groups settle or pass through, they bring new customs, languages, and ideas, forming layers of cultural interaction that quietly blend together, shaping the region in subtle but deeply lasting ways over time. As these groups move closer to the river valleys, they begin to encounter settlements like the ones you have been observing. The interactions are cautious, but not hostile, marked by curiosity rather than resistance. There is no immediate conflict, only a careful recognition of difference. You notice how these newcomers observe the land with a different perspective, seeing not just what is present, but what could be extended or adapted. Their experience with movement allows them to notice patterns others might overlook, like someone who rearranges furniture simply because they have lived in many rooms at the same time. The settled communities continue their routines, largely unchanged, unaware of how these quiet arrivals may influence them over time. The rivers still flow, the fields are still tended, and life continues with its familiar rhythm. Even as new elements begin to enter the scene, there is a subtle blending that begins to take place, not through sudden change, but through repeated contacts. Shared spaces emerge, small exchanges occur, and over time, distinctions soften, creating a layered landscape where different ways of living begin to coexist. you realize that expansion, in this context, is not about taking, but about finding space within what already exists. It is a slow negotiation between movement and settlement, between flexibility and stability, where neither side fully replaces the other. The land itself does not resist these changes. It remains as it always has, offering its resources without preference, allowing those who arrive to find their place within it. The rivers continued their steady course, indifferent to who stands along their banks. And yet, as these movements continue, you begin to sense a deeper shift taking shape beneath the surface. The arrival of new groups brings with it fresh ideas, unfamiliar habits, and slightly different expectations. These changes do not announce themselves, yet they begin to influence the existing balance in quiet ways that are not immediately visible. You stand quietly, watching as another small group appears along the distant horizon, moving steadily but without urgency. Their steps feel measured, almost effortless, as if guided by something larger than intention alone. Their presence does not disrupt the scene, but instead blends into it, like a new color gently added to an already familiar landscape. And within that quiet procession, you begin to understand something subtle but lasting. The earliest steps of change rarely make a sound or demand attention, yet they leave behind traces that linger far beyond the moment. What feels small now will continue to shape the future in ways no one here could fully imagine yet. You continue along the river's gentle curve, and gradually you begin to notice that this place is not simply peaceful by chance, but quietly important in ways that are not immediately obvious. The land does not announce its value, yet everything here feels positioned, as if the meeting of water and soil has created something more significant than comfort alone. Where the rivers draw closer together, the earth becomes richer, darker, and more generous. You notice how the soil holds moisture longer, how plants grow with a steady confidence, and how even the air seems slightly fuller. It becomes clear that this is not just land, but a point of convergence, where life gathers naturally without needing to be invited. You follow the water as it bends inward, forming small junctions and branching paths. These intersections create quiet pockets where people pause, gather, and observe. Over time, these places begin to feel familiar, like natural meeting points, the ancient equivalent of a well-reviewed cafe that everyone somehow agrees is worth visiting without needing a sign outside. The rivers themselves act as guides, shaping movement across the land. Those who travel from afar tend to follow their edges, trusting the presence of water to lead them somewhere meaningful. It is a simple logic, yet one that quietly organizes the flow of people, much like following a familiar road, even when you are not entirely sure where it will end. As more groups arrive and pass through, these river junctions begin to take on new roles. They are no longer just places of rest, but places of exchange. Goods change hands, stories are shared, and knowledge moves from one group to another, creating a slow but steady network of connection. You begin to notice items that do not belong to this land. A piece of stone smoother than the local earth, a crafted object shaped with unfamiliar precision, small traces that hint at distant origins. These objects carry with them the suggestion of places beyond the horizon, quietly expanding the awareness of those who encounter them. The land provides many things generously, yet it does not offer everything. There is an abundance of fertile soil, reeds for construction, and clay for shaping tools and vessels. But there is little stone, and metal is entirely absent. This absence does not feel like a limitation, but it gently encourages interaction, like realizing your kitchen has everything except a spoon, and suddenly valuing your neighbors much more. Because of this exchange becomes not just useful, but necessary. People bring what they have and receive what they lack, forming relationships that stretch beyond individual settlements. These connections are not formalized or controlled, yet they persist, growing stronger with each repeated interaction. You begin to understand that control of water here means more than survival. It shapes where people gather, how they move, and what they can produce. Those who understand the rhythms of the river hold a quiet advantage, not through force, but through familiarity, which, as it turns out, is often the most sustainable form of influence. The openness of the land plays its own role in this balance. There are no walls, no barriers, and no clear borders marking territory. Movement is easy, and access is shared, which creates a sense of freedom, but also a subtle vulnerability, like leaving your front door unlocked, because nothing bad has ever happened. You'll notice how people arrive from different directions, some following the river, others crossing the open plains. Their presence does not disrupt the landscape, but it adds to it, layering new paths and patterns over those that already exist. The land absorbs these movements without resistance. Over time, certain areas begin to stand out, not because they are declared important, but because they are used more often. Paths become clearer, gathering places more defined, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, centers begin to form, like habits that grow simply because they are repeated. Historically, this quiet concentration of activity gradually leads to the emergence of early urban centers, most notably places like Uruk, around 4000 BCE. What begins as repeated gathering and exchange slowly forms a stable core, where people return more often, settle more permanently, and contribute to a growing sense of shared space shaped by routine rather than deliberate planning. These early centers are not cities in the modern sense, without towering structures or rigid boundaries, yet they represent a meaningful shift toward larger and more organized communities. Population and activity begin to cluster with purpose, creating networks of interaction, coordination, and dependence that gently transforms scattered settlements into something more connected, structured, and quietly significant over time. Imagine how Uruk might appear in its earliest stages, a place where more people gather than elsewhere, where exchange is more frequent, and where the rhythms of life begin to align more closely. It is not yet monumental, but it carries the early shape of something that will grow far beyond its beginnings. The people who gather here do not see themselves as part of any grand transformation taking place. They simply respond to what the land offers, making choices that feel practical, immediate, and quietly necessary for daily life. And yet, over time, these small decisions begin to accumulate, forming patterns that stretch far beyond a single lifetime, shaping a future they never paused to imagine. You sit once more near the water's edge, watching as reflections shift and merge on the surface. The rivers continue their steady movement, unaware of the importance others place upon them, which feels slightly humbling, much like realizing the Wi-Fi works perfectly fine without your emotional support. The balance here remains calm, almost delicate, supported by abundance, movement, and quiet cooperation. But it is also clear that such a place cannot remain unnoticed forever. Its openness invites presence, and its richness invites attention, both near and far. As more people arrive, and as more connections form, the land begins to carry a new kind of weight, not heavy or oppressive, but meaningful. It becomes a place not just of living, but of gathering, shaping, and becoming. Though none of this is declared out loud, and as you look across the meeting of the rivers, you begin to understand that a place like this cannot belong to only one group indefinitely. It offers too much, connects too many paths, and quietly draws others toward it, ensuring that its story will always be shared and never entirely still. You remain near the river's edge, and as time passes, you begin to notice that the arrivals no longer feel temporary. Those who once passed through now linger a little longer, building small shelters beside existing homes. They settle gently into the rhythm of the settlement, like a soft new note added to a melody that still feels familiar. At first, their presence feels almost incidental, barely drawing attention from those already living here. They exchange goods, offer quiet help, and move alongside established routines without resistance. There is no tension in their arrival, no sudden disruption. Only a gradual blending that happens so slowly it almost goes unnoticed, like rearranging a room piece by piece over time. You observe how these newcomers begin to settle in spaces that are not quite central, yet not entirely separate either. Their homes reflect the same materials and shapes as those around them, low and simple, as if they are learning the language of the land through careful imitation, choosing connection over distance without ever needing to declare it. Conversations between groups remain calm and open, without hesitation or guarded tones. Shared meals become more common, and small acts of cooperation appear naturally in daily life. One offers grain, another shares knowledge of distant paths, and gradually, familiarity replaces uncertainty, creating a quiet ease that feels both genuine and gently transformative. There are no formal agreements marking these interactions, yet bonds begin to form in subtle and lasting ways. You notice couples from different groups walking together, their lives gradually intertwining beyond simple exchange. These connections do not appear strategic, yet they quietly link communities, creating relationships that deepen over time and are not easily undone. Marriage becomes one of the most subtle forms of integration, blending customs and perspectives without the need for formal declaration. Traditions shift slightly, adapting to include new elements, and over time, what was once distinct becomes shared, like recipes that evolve as they are passed from one kitchen to another. You begin to notice how cooperation slowly extends into the fields, where daily work unfolds with a new sense of shared effort. Farming practices are exchanged without formality, tools pass from hand to hand, and labor becomes more collective. The land is still tended with care, yet now shaped by more hands, more ideas, and quietly expanding understanding. The irrigation channels, once simple and limited to local use, gradually begin to extend further across the land. Newcomers offer their own understanding of how water moves, suggesting small changes that improve flow and reach. These ideas are not forced upon others, but gently shared, and slowly accepted when they prove useful. Water, once guided through narrow and familiar paths, now begins to travel across a slightly broader network. It reaches more fields, supports more crops, and touches more lives than before. This expansion does not appear dramatic, yet it subtly shifts the balance, increasing both productivity and connection in ways that are not immediately recognized. As these systems grow, you begin to observe how certain individuals take on roles in managing the water. Their work requires attention, patience, and understanding, and over time, their knowledge becomes quietly valued. They do not claim authority, yet others begin to listen more closely when they speak. Their influence grows gently, almost unnoticed. Their voices carry a little more weight in discussions, and their presence begins to shape decisions that affect the wider community. No one openly acknowledges this shift, yet it settles into place, like a pattern forming naturally without ever being deliberately designed. Historically, this reflects the gradual expansion of early city-states in Mesopotamia, where growing populations and shared systems of irrigation, labor, and exchange encouraged more structured forms of organization. What begins as small, practical cooperation slowly develops into broader coordination, as communities become increasingly connected through daily activities that require planning, balance, and a quiet sense of collective responsibility. These changes do not arrive all at once, or through any single defining moment, but instead emerge through layers of interaction, cooperation, and adaptation over long stretches of time. Each adjustment builds upon the last, creating systems that feel natural and stable, even though they are constantly evolving beneath the surface of everyday life. The sense of community remains present, yet it slowly begins to take on new and broader dimensions. Relationships extend beyond immediate neighbors, reaching across different groups, and decisions start to reflect a wider circle of people. What was once purely local becomes more collective in nature, though it still exists without rigid boundaries or clearly defined forms of formal authority. You begin to notice that influence here does not arrive through force or sudden declaration, but through quiet, steady presence. It builds gradually, shaped by participation and familiarity, as people work, share, and adapt together over time. Much like water soaking into soil, it alters the texture of life gently, without urgency, yet leaves a lasting effect. There is still no visible conflict, no clear struggle for control, yet something in the balance has shifted. The original rhythms of life continue, familiar and steady, but now they carry additional layers. New patterns weave into the old ones, creating a sense of continuity that feels natural, even as it quietly reshapes the way everything connects. The openness of the land allows this process to unfold without resistance or obstruction. Movement remains easy, and interactions continue to flow naturally between groups. Without barriers to slow it down, change arrives softly rather than abruptly, settling into place over time, like a breeze that passes through unnoticed yet leaves. The air is slightly different afterward. He sits again beside the river, watching how its surface reflects both the sky above and the movement around it, never holding any single image for long. It gently reminds you of the settlement itself, always adjusting, absorbing, and reshaping its form, without ever seeming unstable or uncertain. The people continue their daily routines, mostly unaware of how much has already shifted beneath the surface. Life still feels familiar, predictable, and calm, even as its foundations slowly evolve. Like a quiet update running in the background while everything on the surface appears unchanged, and comfortably the same dot. And as you observe this gentle transformation, you begin to understand that change rarely announces itself in obvious ways. It moves softly, almost invisibly, and by the time it is finally noticed, it has already settled deeply into place, shaping everything in ways that cannot easily be undone or reversed. You remain within the settlement as the days pass, and gradually you begin to notice that one place now draws more attention than the others. It is not announced as important, yet people move toward it more often, gathering there with quiet regularity, as if an invisible thread is gently pulling daily life into a more defined center. This village, once simply one among many, begins to feel different in subtle ways. The dwellings cluster more closely, the paths are more worn, and the sounds of activity linger longer into the day. Nothing feels forced, yet everything seems to align, like furniture slowly arranged into a shape that finally makes sense. You observe how decisions are now discussed, more frequently in a central gathering place, where people come together not out of obligation, but out of habit that has slowly taken root. Voices remain calm and measured, yet certain individuals begin to speak more often, while others listen with greater focus, as if something unspoken is gently guiding attention. Authority does not arrive suddenly or with any formal declaration. Instead, it gathers quietly over time, forming around those who seem most capable of understanding shared concerns. Their presence feels natural rather than imposed, like a familiar path that people begin to follow, simply because it leads where they need to go. These figures do not stand apart from the community in any visible way, yet their roles begin to shift in subtle but meaningful directions. They help organize labor, oversee the flow of water, and coordinate efforts that extend beyond individual households, gradually shaping how the community functions without ever needing to assert control. Their influence grows not through commands or visible power, but through necessity. As challenges become more complex, people begin to rely on those who can offer clarity and guidance. It becomes clear that the ability to solve shared problems carries its own quiet authority, often more persuasive than any formal position could provide. The irrigation networks have expanded, becoming wider and more interconnected than before. What once required only local attention now demands broader coordination, as water must be guided carefully across multiple fields. No single family can manage this alone, and so the need for shared oversight becomes increasingly apparent. Notice how these emerging leaders spend more time near the channels, watching the movement of water with careful attention. They adjust small paths, clear minor blockages, and ensure that the flow remains steady. Their work is quiet and continuous, like tending to something that must be maintained rather than controlled. As responsibilities increase, so does the need for structure within daily life. Tasks are assigned more deliberately, and routines begin to follow clearer patterns. The rhythm of the settlement remains calm and steady, yet it now carries a sense of organization, like a melody that has found its timing even without a visible conductor. the settlement no longer feels entirely separate or self-contained. It begins to function as part of a larger network, with the central village acting as a place of coordination and connection. Nearby communities still maintain their identity, yet they increasingly look toward this center, allowing relationships to shift gently into something more interconnected. Historically, this moment reflects the gradual rise of early cities in Mesopotamia, with places like Uruk emerging around 4000 BCE as some of the first recognizable urban centers. What begins as a gathering of people and activity slowly develops into a stable core, where population increases, interactions intensify, and daily life becomes more interconnected than ever before. This shift marks a transition from loosely connected villages into more organized and structured societies. Labor becomes more specialized, authority begins to concentrate in certain roles, and coordination extends across wider areas. These changes do not feel abrupt, yet they quietly reshape how people live, work, and relate to one another in lasting and meaningful ways. In this emerging structure, a new role takes shape, one that blends leadership with spiritual significance. The figure who guides the community is no longer just an organizer, but also a representative of something beyond the visible world, connecting human activity with the rhythms of the divine. You notice how this leader is approached with a certain quiet respect. People listen carefully, not out of fear, but because their words now carry a sense of alignment with both practical needs and shared beliefs. It is a form of authority that feels grounded rather than imposed. With this shift, the settlement begins to change in how it understands itself. It is no longer simply a village, but something more defined, more connected, and more structured. The change is subtle, yet it reshapes how people relate to their environment and to one another. There are still no dramatic events, no clear moment when everything changes. Instead, the transformation unfolds gradually, marked only by small adjustments that accumulate over time. It is the kind of change that becomes visible only when you look back, not while it is happening. You sit once more near the water, noticing how the reflections now include more movement, more figures, more signs of activity. The river remains steady, but the life around it has grown more complex, layered with new patterns that continue to evolve. The word village begins to feel slightly insufficient, though no one announces a replacement. The identity of the place shifts quietly, shaped by its function rather than its name. Like realizing your simple notebook has somehow turned into an entire archive, you begin to understand that power here does not arrive with noise. It gathers, slowly, settles gently, and becomes part of the landscape without ever needing to declare itself. It is present in the organization of work, the flow of water, and the coordination of daily life. The people continue their routines, yet those routines, now, connect to a larger system. Individual actions contribute to collective outcomes in more visible ways, creating a sense of shared purpose that extends beyond immediate needs. And as you watch this quiet transformation settle into place, you realize that nothing outwardly dramatic has occurred. There have been no proclamations, no ceremonies marking a beginning or an end. Only a gradual redefinition of what this place has become. When the way a place is understood begins to change, even slightly, the lives within it follow. And here, in this moment without noise, a settlement becomes something more, not through force, but through the quiet accumulation of time, need, and shared direction. You remain within the growing settlement, and as time continues its quiet passage, you begin to notice how people respond differently to the changes unfolding around them. Some choose to leave, stepping away from the increasing structure, returning to smaller, more familiar rhythms, while others stay, adjusting themselves gently, like shifting position in a chair until it finally feels just right. Those who leave do so without conflict, carrying their belongings and their habits with them, following paths that lead back towards simpler arrangements. There is no sense of failure in their departure, only preference, as if they have decided that a quieter life suits them better, which is honestly a decision many modern people quietly consider at least once a week. Those who remain begin to adapt, in ways that are subtle but steady. Their roles become more defined, their tasks more consistent, and their days begin to follow patterns that extend beyond immediate needs. It is not a loss of freedom, but a reshaping of it, guided by the growing complexity of the community. You notice that work is no longer shared equally by everyone in the same way. Some continue to tend the fields, but others focus on crafting tools, shaping materials with increasing skill. Their work becomes more refined, their techniques more practiced, creating objects that are both functional and quietly impressive. A new kind of role begins to appear, one that does not involve physical labor in the same way. Individuals begin to record information, marking symbols into soft clay, preserving details that would otherwise fade. At first, these markings are simple, but they carry the remarkable idea that memory can exist outside the mind. This early form of writing, known as cuneiform, emerges gradually as wedge-shaped marks are pressed into soft clay tablets. It becomes one of the earliest writing systems in Mesopotamia, first used to record goods and exchanges. Rather than feeling like a sudden invention, it appears as a natural extension of thought, gently preserving memory beyond the present moment. You watch as someone carefully presses each symbol into the clay, their movements steady and deliberate. There is no sense of urgency, only quiet focus, as if each mark carries meaning beyond its shape. It feels like the beginning of a long conversation, one that will continue far beyond this moment. Though no one here fully realizes it yet, trade begins to take on a clearer and more regular form within the settlement. Goods are exchanged with increasing consistency, and these interactions follow patterns that are gradually understood by everyone involved. What was once occasional becomes expected, forming a steady rhythm that connects people through shared needs and quiet agreements. Certain individuals become known for their ability to manage these exchanges with care and awareness. They move between groups, carrying not only goods, but also information, linking distant parts of the settlement together. Their role is not formally defined, yet it becomes essential, quietly strengthening connections that extend far beyond immediate surroundings. The rhythm of daily life begins to shift. Tasks are no longer decided moment by moment, but follow a loose structure. There are times for work, times for gathering, and times for rest, forming a pattern that repeats with gentle consistency, like a song that quietly loops without ever becoming tiring. You notice how time itself begins to feel different. It is no longer measured only by the sun or the seasons, but also by tasks and responsibilities. The day is divided, organized, and understood in smaller segments, giving it a shape that feels both predictable and purposeful. With this structure comes a sense of reliability. People know what to expect, and expectations create stability. The uncertainty that once came from relying entirely on nature is softened by routines that provide a sense of continuity. Even when the world beyond remains unpredictable, you observe how cooperation continues, but now it is guided more intentionally. Groups work together, not just out of habit, but within an emerging system that coordinates their efforts. It is still calm, still unforced, yet it carries a quiet efficiency that was not present before. There are moments when the older ways seem to linger, small reminders of a time when everything was simpler. A shared meal without structure, a spontaneous gathering, brief glimpses of a rhythm that has not entirely disappeared, but now exists alongside something more organized. The people do not resist these changes. Instead, they move with them, adjusting their lives gradually, like stepping into a river and allowing the current to guide your balance, rather than trying to stand completely still. It is an adaptation that feels natural, even when it is new. Begin to understand that this is how transformation truly happens, not through resistance or force, but through quiet acceptance. The new does not replace the old entirely. It weaves into it, creating something that carries both memory and change. The settlement continues to grow, and with that growth, the patterns of daily life become more clearly shaped. What once felt unfamiliar slowly turns into something expected, even comforting. The rhythms settle gently into place, repeating day after day, until they no longer feel like changes at all, but simply the natural way things unfold. You sit once more beside The river, watching how its steady flow reflects the lives around you. It does not resist the land, yet it never remains the same. It moves, adjusts, and continues forward with quiet consistency, carrying everything along without urgency, much like time itself, moving without ever needing to be noticed as you observe the people moving through their structured yet gentle routines. You begin to understand something deeper. They have not been reshaped by change as much as they have learned to move within it, adjusting their lives with quiet awareness, finding balance not in stillness, but in the steady motion of everyday existence. Over time, what once required attention and effort becomes instinctive. Actions that once felt new now happen without thought, guided by familiarity and repetition. This settlement settles into its rhythm, not because it has been imposed, but because it has been lived, shaped gradually through countless small moments that now feel completely natural. And so, without any clear announcement or recognition, this new order becomes simply the way things are. It blends into the background of daily life, as steady and unremarkable as the flow of water itself, continuing quietly, persistently, and without interruption, shaping everything while asking for nothing in return. You remain within the expanding settlement, and over time you begin to notice that the patterns guiding daily life have become more consistent, more quietly structured. Nothing feels forced or abrupt, yet there is a sense that order now rests beneath every action, like a steady foundation that supports everything without needing to be seen. At the center of this structure stands a figure who represents both leadership and meaning. Someone who is regarded not only as an organizer of people, but also as a bridge between the visible world and something beyond it. This role does not feel distant, yet it carries a quiet weight that others recognize without question. Around this central figure, others take on responsibilities that extend across the settlement. Some oversee the movement of goods, others guide rituals, and a few manage the growing systems that connect different parts of daily life. These roles are not rigidly enforced, yet they are clearly understood, like knowing who usually makes the coffee without needing a schedule. You notice how decisions are now less spontaneous and more deliberate. Discussions still occur, but they follow a pattern, and outcomes are remembered and repeated. This repetition creates a sense of continuity, allowing actions taken once to influence actions taken later, forming the beginnings of something that resembles policy. Clay tablets appear more frequently. Their surface is marked with symbols that record quantities, exchanges, and agreements. These markings are simple, yet they carry a remarkable function, preserving information beyond the moment, like writing a note to your future self, and actually trusting that you will read it. Historically, these early clay tablets represent some of the first economic records in human history, emerging in Mesopotamia as practical tools for tracking goods, labor, and stored resources. They are created not for storytelling, but for clarity, helping communities manage increasing complexity as daily activities become more organized and interconnected over time. These markings do not express emotion or narrative, yet they quietly document the structure of life itself. Each symbol reflects a decision, a transaction, or a record of effort, offering a subtle glimpse into how organization begins to take form, shaping routines and relationships in ways that extend far beyond the moment they are created. You watch as someone carefully inscribes a series of symbols, pressing each mark with intention. There is no urgency in the movement, yet there is precision, a sense that each detail matters, even if no one pauses to admire it. It is work that values clarity over appearance. Nearby, large storage areas begin to take form, holding grain and other resources collected over time. These reserves are not hoarded, but managed, ensuring that supply can meet need, even when conditions shift. It is a system built on foresight, though no one calls it that. The idea of contribution also begins to take shape. People bring portions of what they produce, not as a demand, but as part of a shared structure that supports the whole. It is a quiet form of taxation, though it feels less like obligation and more like participation, which is probably the best possible version of that concept. Those who oversee these resources do so with a calm consistency, tracking what enters and what leaves, maintaining balance without drawing attention. Their work is essential, yet it remains largely invisible, like the mechanisms behind a clock that you only notice when they stop working. You begin to see how control here is not enforced through presence, but through process. Systems guide behavior, creating expectations that people follow naturally. There is no need for constant supervision, because the structure itself provides direction, which is both efficient and slightly impressive. The rituals continue as well, woven into this growing framework. They mark time, reinforce meaning, and connect the practical with the symbolic. These moments do not interrupt daily life, but integrate with it, adding depth without complication. The settlement now operates with a quiet cohesion. Each part supports the others, forming a network that feels stable and It is not rigid, but it is reliable, and that reliability allows life to unfold with a sense of ease that is both earned and maintained. You begin to notice that power here does not arrive with noise or declaration, but settles quietly into the patterns of daily life. It is present in how resources are organized, how routines repeat with consistency, and how roles are understood without explanation. It does not need to raise its voice, because its presence is already felt in everything. It is something almost invisible about this form of authority. It does not stand apart or demand attention, yet it shapes decisions and movements in subtle ways. People follow its structure naturally, not out of obligation, but because it aligns with the flow of their lives, like choosing a familiar path, without ever questioning why. The people move through their days with a growing sense of familiarity, guided by rhythms that now feel steady and dependable. What once required thought and adjustment has become instinctive, and the structure supporting their lives gradually fades into the background, becoming part of the environment itself, rather than something separate from it. You sit once more near the river, watching how its surface reflects not only the sky, but also the quiet order that now defines the settlement. The water flows as it always has, unchanged in its nature, yet the life along its edges has become more coordinated, more connected, like a pattern that has slowly come into focus. Nothing here feels overwhelming or forced, yet everything seems gently linked together. These systems in place are calm, steady, and deeply integrated into daily life. They guide behavior without restricting it, offering direction without pressure, much like a path that leads you forward without ever compelling you to follow it. As you watch this balance continue, you begin to understand that even the softest forms of order leave lasting traces. They shape not only the land and the people, but also the memory of what has been created, even if those impressions are not immediately visible or consciously recognized by those living within them. Because even when power remains quiet and nearly unseen, it still leaves its mark over time. Cliff symbols pressed into clay that endured long after the hands have gone. These subtle structures remain, shaping the future in ways that are felt long after their origins have faded into memory. You continue to wander through the settlement, and over time you begin to sense that the land itself now carries a different kind of meaning. It is no longer a collection of separate villages, but something more unified, more defined, as if invisible. Lines have been drawn not to divide, but to gather everything into a shared understanding. These boundaries are not marked by walls or barriers, yet they exist in the way people speak about the land. They refer to it as a whole, a place with a name, a space that extends beyond individual homes and fields. It is a quiet transformation, like realizing your neighborhood has become a city without anyone announcing it. You notice how movement across this land feels more intentional now. Paths are clearer, routes more established, and journeys between areas follow patterns that repeat over time. What was once open and undefined has become gently structured, shaped by use rather than by decree. Trade begins to expand beyond immediate neighbors, reaching farther distances through networks that grow gradually more complex. Goods move along these routes with a quiet consistency, carried by individuals who have come to understand the value of connection, even if they would never describe it that way. You observe items arriving that could not have originated nearby, materials shaped by distant hands, carrying traces of unfamiliar landscapes. These objects do not feel out of place, but instead blend into the growing system, adding depth to the settlement's understanding of the world beyond its borders. The economy, though still simple, becomes more active. Exchanges happen more frequently, and certain individuals become known for their ability to navigate these interactions. Their role is not formalized, yet it becomes essential, like the person who always knows the fastest route, even when everyone else insists on guessing. At the same time, shared beliefs begin to align more closely. Rituals that were once local now carry a broader meaning, connecting people across the expanding settlement. These practices create a sense of unity, not through uniformity, but through repetition and shared experience. You begin to notice structures rising that differ from ordinary dwellings. They are larger, more deliberate in their design, and positioned in ways that draw attention without demanding it. These are early temples, spaces that anchor both spiritual life and communal identity. Among these structures, the form of the ziggurat begins to emerge, a stepped construction rising gradually upward. It is not merely a building, but a statement, though a quiet one, reflecting a connection between earth and sky, between daily life and something that feels just beyond reach. Historically, the earliest ziggurats in Mesopotamia begin as modest temple platforms, gradually rising in scale and complexity over time. What starts as a simple elevated space for ritual slowly evolves into a more structured form, layered step by step, reflecting both devotion and organization as communities invest effort into building something that stands above everyday life. His structures serve not only as places of worship, but also as centers of administration, where spiritual belief and practical governance quietly intertwine. They become focal points of the community, shaping identity and routine alike, blending the sacred and the functional in ways that guide both thought and action, without ever needing to separate the two. You stand at a distance, observing one of these early structures, noticing how it shapes the space around it. People move toward it with purpose, yet without urgency, as if it is simply part of the natural flow of their day, like checking your phone but with significantly more meaning. The presence of such structures begins to influence how people see themselves. The land is no longer just a place to live, but a place that holds significance, layered with meaning that extends beyond immediate needs. It becomes something to belong to, not just to use. You begin to understand that what people build does far more than shape the land around them. It gently influences how they think, how they organize their days, and how they understand their place within a wider world. The structures rise slowly over time, yet their influence settles deeply, like quiet habits that gradually reshape the rhythm of everyday life. These buildings and shared spaces do not stand alone as physical forms. They become part of a larger pattern, guiding movement, interaction, and even expectation. People adjust themselves to these spaces without noticing, aligning their actions with the structures around them, much like following a familiar routine that feels natural simply because it has been repeated often. The settlement now feels like a cohesive whole, its different parts connected through shared systems, shared beliefs, and shared spaces. It holds together not through force, but through quiet alignment. Stability here does not come from resisting change, but from the ability to absorb it, allowing new elements to settle gently into what already exists. You sit once more near the river, observing how its surface reflects these rising forms. The shapes appear softened by the movement of water, yet they remain clearly present. The river continues its steady flow, unchanged in nature, yet always interacting with the structures that now line its edges, shaping and being shaped at the same time. There is a sense of balance here, but it is not fixed or unmoving. It shifts gradually, responding to the increasing complexity of life within the settlement. The systems that support this place remain steady, yet they are always adjusting, making room for new layers of activity without ever losing their quiet consistency. You begin to realize that stability is not defined by stillness, but by the ability to move with change. The land itself holds the memory of what has been built upon it, even as it continues to evolve. It carries both structure and possibility forward, blending what has existed with what is still emerging. As you observe the settlement in its quiet maturity, you understand that nothing here will remain exactly as it is. The patterns that now feel natural and complete will shift again, just as they have before. Because movement is woven into the foundation of everything that exists in this place. And even within this calm, there is the quiet presence of something beginning to change once more. Beneath the surface of stability, subtle shifts are already forming, preparing the land and its people for another transformation that will arrive gently, almost unnoticed, yet leave its mark in ways that will last far into the future. You remain within the now familiar rhythms of the settlement, and at first, everything seems as steady as it has been. The systems hold, the routines continue, and the structures stand with quiet confidence. Yet beneath this calm surface, you begin to sense something subtle, not a disruption, but a faint tension, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise gentle melody. The settlement is no longer alone in its development. Other centers have grown nearby, each forming its own patterns, its own systems, its own sense of identity. These emerging resemble one another in structure, yet differ in detail. Like neighbors with similar houses, who quietly compare whose garden looks better. At first, their presence does not feel threatening. Trade continues, interactions remain calm, and connections still form across regions. However, as each center grows, the balance between them becomes more delicate, requiring a quiet awareness that was not necessary before. Resources, once abundant, begin to feel slightly more limited. The land still provides, the rivers still flow, but now more people depend on them, and the margin for variation becomes smaller. It is not scarcity in a dramatic sense, but a gentle narrowing, like realizing your favorite snack is no longer always in stock. You notice how attention turns more carefully toward the management of water and land. Irrigation systems expand, but they also require maintenance and coordination. Small disagreements begin to surface, not as conflict, but as differences in perspective on how resources should be shared. Historically, this period reflects the early emergence of rivalries between Sumerian city-states such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, where growing populations and expanding systems begin to overlap. These communities do not immediately engage in constant warfare, but subtle tensions arise as they share boundaries, resources, and influence, gradually shaping relationships that become more complex over time. These tensions develop slowly, often centered around access to fertile land, control of water channels, and the desire to maintain stability within each city-state. Rather than erupting suddenly into large-scale conflict, they unfold through small disputes and shifting alliances, creating a landscape where cooperation and competition exist side by side in a delicate and evolving balance. You observe how conversations become slightly more guarded, how decisions take a little longer, and how the calm certainty that once defined interactions now includes a trace of hesitation. It is not fear, but awareness. The recognition that balance requires effort. At the edges of the land, new groups continue to arrive, following the same quiet patterns of movement you noticed before. Their presence adds further complexity, introducing new needs, new ideas, and new dynamics that the existing systems must absorb. The openness that once allowed easy connection now also allows competing interests to overlap. Without clear boundaries, influence spreads in multiple directions, sometimes reinforcing cooperation, and sometimes creating subtle friction. Like too many people trying to adjust the same thermostat, within the settlement, roles remain defined, yet they begin to shift slightly. Authority is still present, but it is no longer as seamless. Different voices carry different priorities. The unity that once felt natural now requires a bit more attention to maintain. You notice how decisions that once seemed simple now involve more consideration. The systems still function, but they require more effort to keep aligned, like maintaining a balance that was once effortless, but now asks for quiet adjustments. There are no sudden breakdowns, no visible collapse. Instead, there are small inconsistencies, minor delays, and occasional misunderstandings that accumulate over time. Each one is insignificant on its own, yet together they begin to reshape the overall rhythm. The people continue their daily lives, largely unchanged in appearance, yet subtly affected in experience. Their routines persist, but the ease within them shifts slightly, like walking a familiar path that now includes a few unexpected turns. You sit again beside the river, watching how its flow remains steady even as the land around it grows more complex. The water itself does not change its nature, yet it responds to channels and barriers placed along its path, adjusting its course in quiet ways that reveal both flexibility and quiet persistence over time. As you observe this gentle movement, you begin to understand that stability is never something fixed or untouched. It shifts and adapts, responding to pressures from within and beyond. In doing so, it reveals a delicate balance, one that depends not on stillness, but on the ability to adjust without losing its underlying continuity. The city-states continue to grow and develop, each following its own rhythm while remaining connected to others nearby. They interact, exchange, and occasionally compete, their relationships evolving slowly. There is no single turning point, only a series of small, steady adjustments that gradually reshape the landscape without ever announcing themselves as significant change. You begin to notice how the sense of unity, once effortless, now feels slightly more fragile. It does not break apart, but it stretches, requiring more attention to maintain. Connections still exist, yet they are no longer automatic, like friendships that deepen over time but need quiet care to remain strong. Even so, daily life continues, with a sense of calm persistence. The fields are still tended, the markets remain active, and rituals continue to mark the passage of time. Nothing stops or pauses in response to uncertainty. Instead, life moves forward, carrying these subtle shifts along as part of its natural rhythm. You realize that change does not always arrive with force or clear visibility. Sometimes it appears as small, nearly invisible cracks, spreading slowly across a surface that once seemed entirely whole. These changes do not shatter what exists, but gently reshape it, altering its form while preserving its continuity. As you watch the river continue its steady journey, you begin to sense that these quiet transformations are not signs of ending, but of beginning. The balance has shifted, almost imperceptibly, and within that shift lies the foundation for something new, already forming beneath the surface of what feels familiar. The river flows on, unchanged in its nature, yet always responding to the world around it, and in that steady movement, you recognize a pattern that extends beyond this moment, where every subtle change carries within it the quiet promise of another cycle, waiting patiently to unfold. Because the flow never truly stops. It bends, it adjusts, and it continues, carrying forward everything that has been and everything that is yet to come, into another cycle that is already, quietly, underway. You return once more to the quiet edge of the river, and as you stand there, everything feels both familiar and distant at the same time. The land has changed, the people have changed, and yet something beneath it all remains steady, like a memory that never quite fades, even when its details begin to soften. You think back to the earliest moments, when the land held only small villages scattered gently across the wide plain. Each one followed its own slow and steady rhythm, shaped by the cycles of water, soil, and season. There were no boundaries to define them, only open space, where life moved quietly and without the need for anything beyond what was close at hand. There were no walls, no central places, no systems beyond what was needed to sustain daily living. Everything unfolded with a kind of simplicity that now feels almost weightless, as if time itself moved more slowly. People lived within the land rather than shaping it, guided by patterns that felt natural, familiar, and gently continuous. Then, almost without notice, those early villages begin to gather more closely, their paths crossing with greater frequency over time. Connections deepen, and decisions start to reach beyond individual households. Slowly and quietly, the sense of a shared place emerges, not through any declaration, but through countless small actions that gradually shape a collective way of living together. Remember how influencer arrives not as a visible force, but as a steady presence that settles into daily life. New people arrive, bringing unfamiliar ideas that gently take root. Change moves like water into soil, spreading without urgency, reshaping everything in quiet ways, like a conversation that continues long after its beginning has been forgotten. The settlement gradually becomes a center, and that center evolves into something more structured and connected. Roles begin to form, systems take shape, and authority gathers in ways that feel natural rather than imposed. What once required constant agreement begins to follow patterns, and those patterns become the quiet foundation supporting everyday life. You reflect on how writing appears, pressing memory into clay so that moments can endure beyond the present. Trade stretches farther, reaching beyond familiar horizons, while beliefs begin to align across distance. The land itself takes on deeper meaning, no longer just a place to live, but something that carries connection, memory, and purpose across time. Power, too, begins to take shape in ways that feel quiet and continuous, rather than sudden or forceful. It organizes, guides, and connects, becoming part of the environment instead of standing above it. It does not need to announce itself, because it is already present within systems, routines, and shared understandings that gently structure everyday life. Even as everything appears stable on the surface, subtle changes continue beneath that calm. New pressures emerge gradually, connections stretch a little further, and the balance that once felt effortless begins to ask for more attention. Small cracks form, not breaking anything apart, but slowly reshaping the surface in ways that are quiet and lasting. You begin to understand that nothing along this path has truly disappeared. Villages have not vanished. They have transformed into something new. The people have not lost their rhythms. They have adapted them over time. Even power itself does not arrive or leave, but simply changes form, moving like water through shifting channels across the land. The river flows beside you, unchanged in its nature, yet always different in its details from one moment to the next. It carries fine silt from distant places, gently reshaping the land grain by grain, just as time reshapes the lives unfolding along its banks, never resisting change, and never holding tightly to what has already passed. You notice how the places where villages once stood have softened into the surrounding land, their outlines fading but never fully erased. The earth holds memory in quiet ways, preserving traces of what has been, even as it continues to support what is, blending past and present into a single, continuous, and gentle unfolding. The city, the systems, the structures, all feel present, yet also temporary. Like patterns drawn in sand that will eventually be smoothed away, they matter, they shape lives, and yet they do not last forever, which is perhaps what allows them to exist at all. You sit down near the water, letting the steady sound of its movement settle around you. The breeze moves gently across the surface, carrying with it the faintest rustle of reeds, a soft and continuous sound that asks nothing from you. It becomes gently clear that what you have witnessed is neither a true beginning nor a final ending, but simply a quiet moment within a cycle that continues beyond any single place or time. Villages become cities, cities become systems, and systems slowly soften and shift, again and again, like patterns forming and dissolving within an endless, flowing current. Each empire, each structure of power, feels less like something permanent and more like a brief pause within a much larger movement. Forms rise, take shape, and eventually fade, yet nothing is entirely lost. Every moment leaves behind a trace, something subtle that continues forward, carried gently within the quiet unfolding of time. The rhythm of the story begins to slow, softening until it matches the steady movement of the river beside you. There is no urgency here, no need to follow what might come next. There is only the calm presence of what is unfolding at its own pace, inviting you to simply rest within it. You begin to feel the stillness settled more deeply around you, as if the world itself has softened its edges. Sounds grow quieter, the light dims into a gentle glow, and the space around you feels open and unburdened, like a quiet room at the end of a long day, holding nothing but calm. The river continues to move, carrying with it everything that has been and everything that will be, without separation or distinction. It does not hold on to names, places, or power. It simply flows, steady and continuous, like a quiet breath that never needs to be noticed in order to continue. And as you remain there, listening to the soft meeting of water and wind, you begin to understand that the story does not truly end, nor does it need to continue. It simply moves, gently and endlessly, through time, allowing you to rest within its quiet rhythm. As everything slowly drifts into stillness, the script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.